parents, but it was just like, I don't know, I haven't had a lot of Google in my life, so I didn't really know what was missing.
Well, we could do a cooking class, different types of
I think we should get her kind of like Google healthy.
Yeah.
That's my two cents.
It was very awesome. Thanksgiving. It was on Thanksgiving.
Well, I think there's gonna be an announcement coming out in the newsletter or something. So if you would be
I mean, if
interested.
I'm able to, I'm always game for a cooking class, it's just whether or not.
So usually what we would do normally is have it on like a Sunday afternoon.
Well, that Sundays, that's great, but
Thank you.
like, I might have a baby soon. It's kind of hard to coordinate that.
Oh, well then we need to incorporate childcare into our classes.
I mean, yeah.
We've got like a scene.
Yeah.
Well,
Sure.
He's the proudest to get ready.
He does. That's true. He does. Good
good.
afternoon.
Oh, wait, is this the topic? I have something to send you, but I'm not really good at how you get it off Facebook to me to send to you, but it's Dr. Laura Schlesinger's comments and everybody see that
I didn't
thing?
see it, but I know who she is.
She made something and then somebody replied using all these biblical quotes to her, kind of making fun of her. Oh, well then this and that. If I learn how to send it to you, I will.
Thanks, Rick. So good afternoon and happy early Hanukkah, and thank you for joining us again for our adult education. Our first class that we're going to do, we are again moving from more general distinctions between the big denominations of Judaism into some of the more specific topics that we find similar or dissimilar. Last week I thought was a fascinating discussion. Oh, come on in. On the question of matrilineal and patrilineal descent. Hopefully it was helpful for you. This week, I thought that we'd discuss the topic of same-sex marriage within the denominations. I thought about doing LGBTQ in general, but it turns out that's a very expansive topic. The identifying, the supporting, the partnership, when you get into things like transgender, they're all their own topics. So we're gonna go slowly through some of those throughout the year. But since this is one of the major facets of the LGBTQ situation within religious denominations, I thought that this is where we would begin. So just like last time, I have for you some textual sources that will help guide us and educate us as to where our movement stands and where our fellow movements stand in the statements that they are making, okay, regarding this issue. And I think hopefully at the end, this is not as much text, I don't think, as the matrilineal and patrilineal descent. Hopefully we'll have some discussion, some time for some discussion as to some of the ramifications of support and not support, okay? So let's start with us as we normally do so that we get a good baseline as to, thank you, sweetie. It's great, it's proud of you. As to where we stand as a movement. So we were the first of the major denominations to take a liberal position towards homosexuality in general. Adopting the first of many resolutions on behalf of gays and lesbians in 1977. That actually was done by the Women of Reform Judaism before the Union of Reform Judaism did so. It was the Women of Reform Judaism who came together to make a statement of support. It took until 1996 until gay marriage was officially endorsed by the rabbinate, meaning by the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, voted on the resolution as to whether we would support. Great. Okay. Wonderful. As to whether we would support In 1996, it was still a relatively new and how many jewels, Patricia? Well done. Well done. Yeah. Relatively new and unsteady aspect in all sort of denominations. My older colleagues will tell me that when they went to the CCAR conference in 1996 and that resolution came onto the table, all 500, 600, whatever it is, rabbis at the Central Conference of American Rabbis voted for it. When they went back to their congregations, if somebody asked, they all said they voted against it. So this is for same-sex marriage. Okay? Meaning that the rabbis weren't particularly sure how their congregations would react to that. The rabbis knew that it was the right way. Luckily, a year later, the URJ came forward and it was formally adopted into our system. So it didn't take very long, and it wasn't a particularly difficult thing to pass. One more thing to mention, and this is something that is its own issue, so I don't want to spend too much on it, but HUC, JAR, Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, began accepting openly LGBTQ applicants in 1990. And we say openly, there are plenty of our colleagues who had to hide the fact that they were gay for many, many years. Finally, in 1990, it was an important move so that rabbis not only could come and be their true selves in seminary, but could be ordained proudly. And that was in terms of gay and lesbian. It was later when we had our first transgender rabbi, actually relatively recently ordained, sometime this century, the 21st century. But that is something just simply to mention. So most importantly, as we're going to discuss the idea of same-sex marriage, I thought I would do two things for us in terms of the Reform view. One is to give you the text of the actual resolution that was adopted in 1996 at the 107th Annual Convention of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, March 1996. Each convention, each resolution that came to the table was not the only resolution that came to the table. And every time we go to another CCAR conference, we have more and more and more. So this one was basically inconsistent, was consistent with some of the other ways. So most importantly, this is not an act of responsa. This is not a rabbinic question and a rabbinic answer. This is a resolution from the rabbis to the rabbis as to where the rabbinical view stands. So consistent with our Jewish commitment to the fundamental principle that we are all created in the divine image, the Reform movement has, quote, been in the vanguard of the support for the full recognition of equality for lesbians and gays in society, end quote. In 1977, the CCAR adopted a resolution encouraging legislation which decriminalizes homosexual acts between consenting adults and prohibits discrimination against them as persons, followed by its adoption in 1990 of the substantial position paper on homosexuality and the rabbinate. Then in 1993, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, that's the UAHC, the predecessor for the URJ, observed that, quote, committed lesbian and gay couples are denied the benefits routinely accorded to married heterosexual couples, end quote. The UAHC resolved that full equality under the law for lesbian and gay people requires legal recognition of lesbian and gay relationships. Okay, what they're saying is, from a legal point of view, not just a Jewish point of view, this is where we stand. In light of this background, be it resolved that the Central Conference of American Rabbis support the right of gay and lesbian couples to share fully and equally in the rights of civil marriage. Be it further resolved that the CCAR oppose governmental efforts to ban gay and lesbian marriage. And be it further resolved that this is a matter of civil law and is separate from the question of rabbinic officiation of such marriages. In other words, friends, we support gay and lesbian marriages in the secular world. We do this from a rabbinic view, we view this from a Jewish view, but it is a separate issue from the she'elah, the question, and the responsa, the rabbinic analysis as to the why. Now, we do this from time to time. The CCAR will simply say, we support this. We support this from a secular view. Obviously, we will go into the more details of it in terms of the rabbinic officiation of marriages, which means that we can say all well and good, we accept gay and lesbian marriage, but how do we do it later in terms of from a Jewish point of view? How do we alter the things that we need to alter or not to get into the idea of officiation of a Jewish marriage, okay? So one is a resolution of support. Then we're going to move forward as to one of the questions brought before the rabbis as to how to do so. Before we move on to the rabbinic responsa idea, any quick questions about this resolution which took place in 1996?
One question. Okay, from the religious point of view, okay, that was accepted, same-sex marriage. But then what about, okay, for the secular, the role of Judaism or any religion to become, let's say, actively involved in the political, in the secular world?
Mm-hmm. So what you're asking is this.
You can accept it as the religion, but to become, let's say, politically active as a force, as a...
Well, that's different. I mean, we have a political arm. We have the RAC, the Religious Action Center, which sends resolutions and sends and lobbies to Congress and things like that, and publicly presents our view of the secular issues. So once this went forward in 1996, the RAC got a hold of it and let the senators and congressmen and all know this is where Reform Judaism stands from a political point of view.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. So the question, one of many questions that occurred as to, okay, now we support it. What does that mean in terms of if a couple comes before a rabbi, how can we proceed fully with the reform movement, both the Central Conference of American Rabbis and the URJ and HUCJAR all now accepting it. One of the questions, the she'elah is a question, a rabbinic question that is asked before rabbis, is about marriage as kiddushin. Kiddushin, if you've ever been to a Jewish wedding or if you've ever been married, there is a section of the Jewish marriage ceremony called kiddushin, which is a holiness moment which takes place. It is a very old, very traditional, very necessary liturgical aspect of the Jewish wedding, which we will go into more details. The language, as you can imagine, for kiddushin is between a man and a woman. So the question is, how do we deal with the fact that this ancient aspect, holiness within the ideas of marriage, which stems back to biblical ideas, how do we alter that in the idea of kiddushin? Okay? The she'elah begins and states, and this is before the Supreme Court ruling, okay? In states where same-sex marriage and civil unions are legal by civil law, is it appropriate for Reform rabbis to officiate at a ceremony of marriage of two Jews of the same sex and to consider the union kiddushin? You see that those are two questions, right? Can we officiate a ceremony of marriage, of partnership? And once we do so, are we able to consider that union to be the same as a woman and man would in Judaism with the idea of kiddushin? Okay? It goes on, is it appropriate for Reform rabbis in states that have not yet legalized same-sex marriage to officiate at a ceremony of marriage of two Jews of the same sex and to consider that union kiddushin? In other words, if it is illegal in the country in which we reside, are we able to do it still because we view it to be okay? There is a Talmudic principle that is very strong throughout the Talmud, and that is dina de malchuta dina, which means the law of the land is the law, meaning that American law, if you live in America, overrides Jewish law, whether that's in America, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in Russia, when it's in Australia, it doesn't matter. The law of the land in which you law has the opportunity and the ability to override Jewish law, meaning those ideas of the laws of God, all those things are higher. That does not exist in Judaism. We respect and understand the laws of the countries in which we reside. A great example of that is the idea of state-required autopsy. There are states in America which require that any death is given a full autopsy. Autopsy is against Jewish law and orthodoxy and in conservative Judaism. However, Dina de Malchuta Dina comes in and says, we're not going to tell the state you can't do an autopsy. It is the law in the place in which we live. The same is true here. If Dina de Malchuta Dina, if the law says that gay marriage is not legal in a state, how are we to deal with that from a positive point of view? We want to do these marriages, we support these marriages, but by doing so, we may come into conflict with the local law, if that makes sense. Okay? So, obviously it says we've been fully supportive of social equality for lesbian gays. It goes over again, that next paragraph goes over again the resolutions in 1977, 1996, all these sort of things about what had happened. So we know that we support it. Great, wonderful. The bottom paragraph, however, on this page, same-sex marriages, kiddushin, is the real question, okay? Our she'elah, our question, pertains to two individuals of the same sex. Now, here, this is not a question of interfaith marriage. That's a whole different story. This is considering that both are Jews, both are members of the covenant of Israel, and they wish to be joined in marriage in a ceremony, specifically kiddushin, in which a rabbi serves as an officiant in Seder, meaning all of those things are what we're talking about. You are members of the Jewish faith, you want to be married, and specifically you want to be kiddushin, you want it to be married by a rabbi. All the other stuff we're not going to focus on. If you want to go to a legal, secular, a judge, whatever, that's not our territory. This is the territory when it's ours, okay? Our starting point is the recognition, and this is very, very important, that homosexuality is neither a chit, it's neither a sin, nor to'eva, an abomination, okay? As was long prevailing opinion. In other words, we reject the idea fully to start off with that homosexuality is a sin or an abomination, okay? We fully reject that idea. There's abundant scientific and psychological evidence that homosexuality is an inherent sexual orientation and not a, quote, lifestyle choice, as has often been erroneously claimed. In other words, friends, this is a marriage, sorry for the pun, but a marriage between the understanding of Jewish tradition and, okay, how you doing? Good. Between Jewish tradition and the fact that we understand the role of science, of psychology, of philosophy, all these secular topics that can teach us to expand our knowledge about these things, okay? By using a scientific knowledge and psychological evidence, we are able to make the claim that the biblical idea, the Torah idea that homosexuality is an abomination is incorrect, okay? Our tradition is grounded in justice and ethics. Reform Judaism is based upon the ethics and the justice of the prophets, and both demand that we recognize not only the full humanity and equality of homosexuals, but that their love and commitment are no less those than heterosexuals. Okay, that's a very important paragraph to saying that before we even talk about the liturgy and the rules and the halakha or whatever it is, we have to see where we stand as a movement on this issue in the first place. We reject the idea that it is an abomination, okay? Now, we move into the section of the She'elah about the ceremony itself, okay? When Jews stand under the chuppah, under the wedding canopy, we celebrate the joining together of two individuals in a relationship of equality and love. This is across the board here that we're saying that. One that promises emotional as well as sexual fulfillment, one that allows them to build a home that expresses Jewish values. All of those things are very important, not just in homosexual marriage, but heterosexual marriage. The idea that there is an emotional connection, the idea of if you were at my Torah on tap, You will see how important Talmudically sex is in a marriage. It is an obligation, so it's very, very important. Okay, and the idea of building a home. The chuppah, the wedding canopy, is a metaphor for the home that they will build together. Okay, this is in essence what we mean when we call our marriages by the name kiddushin, meaning holy. Okay, there is this holy aspect to it. If gay and lesbian couples, no less than their heterosexual counterparts, can aspire to that kind of relationships, which we believe that they can, it would seem that their kiddushin, or marriage as we Reform Jews understand those terms, are fit names for it. In other words, there is no reason to believe that a homosexual couple cannot find the same holiness in each other as a heterosexual couple in Jewish view. We believe that they would have equality. We believe that they would have love. They would have an emotional connection. They would have sexual fulfillment, and they would build a home of Jewish values. All of those things we check off. It's exactly the same from a heterosexual to a homosexual couple. Okay? In short, the union of marriage between two Jews deserves to be called kiddushin, the tradition's term for Jewish marriage. This is the major statement of the responsa right here, okay? And we'll see how that is not where the other denominations will go, okay, in this direction. Our direction is to say we don't have to change anything. This is kiddushin because those couples are the same as heterosexual couples. We call it kiddushin. This is the rabbinic halachic understanding of Jewish, gay marriage in Reform Judaism, okay? We look back to the Mishnah, the second century rabbinic text, which stipulates that a Jewish marriage can be contracted by any of the three ways, okay? These are 2nd century CE, okay? With money, okay? Meaning a man gives a woman an object of value, such as a ring or a coin. In the presence of two witnesses, she freely accepts the object. By the way, this is not just Mishnaic. This was something that is Near Eastern and ancient in times. A gift to someone, okay, represents a certain part of that proposal. Through the shtar, the written deed in which the phrase "through this deed" establishes the marriage, right? We have the ketubah, which is you write it down and you sign it, okay? It's a contract, okay? Or by sexual congress with the intention of creating marital bond, okay? Those are the three, not just Mishnaic, okay, but ancient ideas of how you wed someone. There is a gift, there is a vow, and there is sexual procreation, okay? Sexual things go to procreation, okay? On another class, in another world, in another dimension that I will teach probably, hopefully this year, not this one, you will see that there was this exchange between two men in the Tanakh, between David and Jonathan in the Tanakh. They exchange. You got to read the prophets. It states that David loved Jonathan above all else. He provided him with a gift. He provided him with a vow, and it seemed like they got pretty close. So, though what we believe, though the biblical writer couldn't write it explicitly, there are many scholars who believe that that was the first gay marriage in the Bible, and that was between King David, who, by the way, had plenty of other wives and husbands. Okay, but this was really a beautiful idea of homosexual love in the Bible. If you try to argue this, you got to be really well known about ancient rights and all these sort of things, okay? Because there's a lot of people who will clap back at that really well. But that is for another class, okay? But what's important is those three things, okay? Those are from the Mishnah, the idea, okay? The rabbis strongly disapproved of the third method. Of course they did, okay? Today, kiddushin, the betrothal, is transacted through the giving and acceptance of an object of monetary value, meaning usually a ring. This, by the way, is common practice. The money value where you used to buy someone now is the engagement ring, okay? There is you purchase something and you provide it to somebody else as a gift, okay? That is the symbolic aspect that has now become our world, okay? So if you want to know where that came from, it's money, okay? So it used to be how many ladies around the room, how many sheep you were worth, or how many cattle you were worth, or how much your dowry was, or whatever it is. Nowadays, it's just, now it's a ring, okay? The ketubah is very much the same, though. The ketubah is a written contract to say we're going to be together, and we both sign it. It's very, very, very similar. And of course, you have to afterwards. What's the word? Consummate. You have to consummate the marriage. Okay, so those are the three things that still exist. Okay. At the core of this legal contract lie the underlying Jewish values that characterize Kiddushin. These flow, we believe, from the verse, quote, "It is not good for a person to be alone." Genesis 2:18. You'll notice the way that we translate that, okay? Person here is probably ha'adam, okay? Ha'adam, which means humanity, could very well be translated to man. It is not good for man to be alone. However, the Hebrew is ambiguous. So it is not good for a person to be alone, by which we understand that Torah supports loving and committal marital relationships as a natural state of human existence. This is about as far as Jews will go in terms of that marriage is biblical, okay? And the fact that we're supposed to find a partner in life, that it's not good for us to be alone, okay? We would hope such relationships are a source of joy for the two people involved. We would hope so. And a blessing to family members, friends, and the Jewish community. Our tradition strongly frowns on celibacy and encourages life partnerships. Finding an Ezer Kenegdo, Genesis 2:20, a mutually supportive and enriching life partner, is an enduring Jewish value, as is living and loving and committed relationship. The union of a same-sex couple, no less than that of an opposite-sex couple, can be defined by these commitments. It is therefore qualifies in our view, and this is the main statement, as Kiddushin. For this reason, we are not persuaded by the suggestion raised by some that same-sex marriages are to be designated by a different term. In other words, friends, it's marriage.
Good.
Marriage is marriage is marriage. Yes.
I got a question. Since you said there were three things part of the contract.
Yeah.
Okay, number three, for procreation. Okay, that would be impossible. Because usually that's for, let's say, a formulation of a family. So
Correct.
if you have three things, let's say, within a contract, though, wouldn't that kind of void, if there's something, you know what I'm trying to say? There's certain aspects that can make it
Well, yes.
void because the
The
essential elements, so there were three things, there were three elements that,
sexual fulfillment is the third. We'd hope that it would lead to children.
which would, but in the same sex, that's kind of impossible. So that makes that contract.
But we don't think that. We don't void it simply because of the result, right? The idea is that if you have, and this, by the way, is the Mishnaic understanding, right? Is and this is 2nd century, so we've come a lot farther from this, okay? But if you give something of value, if you do a contract and you enjoy a marital bond of sexual fulfillment, you have done all three. Okay, we're speaking about it is not good for a person to be alone in Genesis 2:18. We are not speaking about fruitful and be fruitful and multiply. Okay, that is a different commandment. So we're taking the idea of partnership. Again, this is an interpretation of halakha to say. Some would say that is a necessary part of marriage. Reform Judaism does not say that it's a part of
But
marriage.
then you're going into the contract, which is a redefinition of family. In other words, of what is family, let's say. You know,
Not necessarily.
adults and children.
Not
Because it's all-
necessarily. The contract, the ketubah doesn't necessarily have to mention children or procreation in that way at all. It's just a contract between two people. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay? Yes.
We can't have kids.
Right. There are many reasons why. Right. And this was some of the things that came up in the Supreme Court decision. Right. There are lots of reasons why couples don't have kids. Right. Being gay is not just the only reason as to why people don't have kids. Right. Correct. So the procreation is the hope, but the sexual fulfillment is the need. How's that?
Can I ask a question? So you were saying at the beginning that it also might not be allowed by the law of the land. So how did the reform decide? Was it allowed if the law of the land doesn't allow it or not?
You're right. So that came into the answer later. We had to do Dina Malchuta Dina. We had to do the idea that we couldn't do anything illegal, meaning we could not sign any legal paperwork to say that, and this sort of made the answer easy, right? In every Jewish ceremony, the rabbi signs both the Jewish ketubah and the marriage license. If there is no marriage license by the state, we're unable to do it. We want to, but we can't literally sign it. So what we would do is we would send people to the states where they could do it and send it to rabbis who could do it. But that was a relatively easy aspect of Dina Malchut Dina, meaning we can't get the paperwork necessary to do it, right? They won't allow us to do that, okay? When the Supreme Court did rule, we were able to jump in and make sure we get all the necessary paperwork, and the answer had already been finished for us. So we were just waiting for that to go. So we didn't have to send people to New York or Hawaii anymore. We could go anywhere. Okay? So overall, hopefully to take away from all of that is that the reform movement not only wanted to say that it supports from a secular point of view the idea of homosexuality, but from a halakhic Jewish traditional point of view has understood that we can simply treat gay marriage the same exact way that we would with heterosexual marriage. Now, if you look in the Reform Rabbi's Manual, you'll see that we now have various ideas as to how to say the ancient words that used to say man and women. Either we can change them to 2 men or 2 women, or we can change to alternative vows that they can say. There are even alternative of the 7 blessings that are said that are a little more gender neutral. Basically, we shift those terminology because we can, because we believe that it is the exact same ceremony, just with a few words changed, okay? Now, we will see in our conservative friends another route. It eventually leads to the same thing, where same-sex marriage is accepted, but they went another halakhic interpretation, okay? Completely different from ours, okay? Conservative Judaism in 2006, okay? Remember, conservative Judaism is always about 8 to 10 years behind us, okay? The conservative movement concluded that polarizing debate over homosexuality with the endorsements of 2 contradictory opinions, one upholding the movement's previous rejection of gay relationships, and another retaining the Torah prohibition on male anal sex, but allowing for other forms of sexual intimacy between members of the same sex. The latter opinion also explicitly endorsed the ordination of gay and lesbians as rabbis and cantors. Both opinions are considered equally valid, and individual conservative rabbis may choose which one to follow, okay? This is not where the Reform movement stood. The Reform movement said, this is where we stand. The conservative movement said, we see there's a split. We see there's people who believe one way and believe another way. We're going to leave it up to you, okay? That being said, there are other things that we're going to see moving forward as to the debate, okay? In 2015, I wanted to make sure that we read this. The conservative movement, the Rabbinic Assembly, put out a statement celebrating the Supreme Court's ruling on gay marriage. This is really important, okay? They did not have to do this. This is what they did to show that whether they believe that, and they do believe in the autonomy of conservative rabbis to say yes or no, they do support it. In response to the Supreme Court's landmark decision, today calling the Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional and dismissing an appeal for supporting any anti-gay marriage law in California, the Rabbinical Assembly released the following statement. Judaism views marriage as sacred responsibility, not only between the partners, but also between the couples and the larger community. Our movement, meaning the conservative movement, recognizes and celebrates marriages, whether between partners of the same sex or the opposite sex. We therefore celebrate today's decision on gay marriage by the Supreme Court. It was added on behalf of the 1,700 rabbis of the Rabbinical Assembly. I join with Jews across California and the United States in acknowledging today's Supreme Court decisions as opening the way for loving and committed same-sex couples to enjoy the rights and privileges of marriage. This is most clearly modeled with the case of Edith Windsor, a Holocaust survivor who enjoyed a loving relationship with her wife for many decades and had been unable to inherit her partner's estate as her spouse, okay? Yes?
I get so confused. So the Rabbinical Assembly,
Yeah.
that both conservative, all Jewish people are on that, or just the conservative, or just?
The Rabbinical Assembly is the conservative movement's version of our Central Conference of American Rabbis.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying, Jane. So this was the 1,700 rabbis that are part of the United Hebrew Congregation, what's it called? Anyway, their version of the URJ, right? So when they went to their conference, they came and did their own statement, the Rabbinical
So
Assembly,
the
okay?
conservatives are now saying they're okay with it.
They're saying in 2015, we celebrate it. We celebrate the secular ruling,
Right.
okay? Now that doesn't necessarily mean where they stand on the Jewish ruling, okay? Yes. We're gonna get there. Yes. Yes. I want to make sure that we cover our bases, friends, okay? We're gonna cover our bases. So again, just like with the reform movement, we need to distinguish between support for the secular law and then what do we do with it from Jewish law? Okay, those are two separate issues no matter what denomination you are for. You can say, yay, we appreciate secular law, but then what do we do? Okay, it can go either way. Now, eventually, you will see that the conservative movement does provide that opportunity. They go about it a completely different way, though. It's very fascinating, which we wanted to bring today. Okay. In 2012, okay, this was a paper that was written by Elliot Dorff, who and Daniel Nevins and Abram Reiser. These are big conservative rabbis. They've written many books, including one called The Observant Life, which is this big, thick book of how conservative Jews believe and what they do. And we have the same one written by Mark Wachowski that basically says this is what we as Reform Jews think. Okay, so Elliot Dorff, his views are very well known and understood. And this was a paper that he wrote. His paper was then approved by the Rabbinical Assembly to say, okay, this is where we stand. Okay. And I couldn't put all of it in. Obviously, there's a lot of text, okay, on a paper, but I did want to highlight a few things, okay? Most importantly, unlike the Reform movement, the conservative movement had hesitation about calling same-sex marriage kiddushin, okay? As you recall from the Reform movement, we said it is kiddushin, and here's why. The conservative movement says we are fine with it. We want gay people to be able to get married. We fully support it. However, what we're hesitant about is the terminology, okay? First, they say the ancient model of kiddushin, which may be translated as sanctification, holiness, or what I said, or designation, is an inherently non-egalitarian model of marriage. In other words, like Reform Judaism did acknowledge, the old way of kiddushin is not egalitarian. It's man and a woman. It's man and woman, okay? We said, it doesn't matter. We said, this is our interpretation of it. The conservative movement says, well, if it says man and women, we have to look at this a little bit differently, okay? The original concept from antiquity, which polygamy was permitted, was for a man to designate a woman for himself in a one-way exclusive arrangement. She was exclusively his, but he was not exclusively hers. Already 1,000 years ago, the decree of Rabbeinu Gershom began to change this reality by banning polygamy in the Ashkenazi community. You will see this, by the way, that in all Jewish law discussions, we have to cover some of the tangents as to some of the things that also are affected. In this case, polygamy was a part of the idea of kiddushin. This was something that they had to mention. Conservative wedding ceremonies have for many decades emphasized an egalitarian ideal in the exchange of rings, have modified the ketubah text to include commitments from the woman, which is great. It's not just like an Orthodox saying, this is what you are going to do for me. It is both people, just like in a Reform context, saying we will both love each other, we'll both support each other, all those sort of things. And have made us poetic verses such as Ani Ladodi V'Dodi Li. I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine, which comes from the Song of Songs, okay? Reform Judaism uses this a lot as well because the original marriage vow is through a man and a woman. If you have two men or two women, by saying Ani Ladodi V'Dodi Li, there is no gender specific. I am my beloved is mine. That becomes the vow, okay? Which emphasizes mutual devotion and love in marriage. Still, we have worked within the boundaries of the established rituals and texts so that our weddings can fulfill traditional halachic requirements, even as they express our egalitarian views. Pay attention to that sentence. We are the conservative movement is saying is, we are fully supportive, we love these ideals, but we are restricted by traditional halachic requirements. We have to stay within those boundaries, okay? This is a very different interpretation than the Reform view, which was we can modify those halachic values and interpretation. If you are at a stance where you say this is traditional halakha, we cannot modify it, how do we get around it? Okay? That was the first issue, okay, that they had with kiddushin. The second was to apply kiddushin model to same-sex marriage, flows from the previous one. According to Jewish law, a woman who has been designated as a wife by a Jewish man requires a Jewish writ of divorce, a get, from him in order to terminate the marriage and marry again. Reform Judaism has done away with the idea of the get, by the way. Although this practice is mandated by a specific passage in the Torah, it has been the source of great suffering in many Jewish communities because a woman whose husband refuses a Jewish divorce, even after a civil divorce, remains aguna, chained to him, unable to marry. This occurs quite a bit in Orthodoxy, okay, is that a woman cannot divorce a man until he allows her to do so, okay? You can see why Reform Judaism did away with this, okay? We believe in the equal understanding of marriage, and therefore divorce, even certainly within the civil idea, is once it's done, it's done, and it is a mutual thing, okay? Okay, the conservative movement has taken substantial measures to address this iniquity. One, we do not allow a Jewish man who has failed to provide a get to his prior Jewish wife to remarry until he does so. We use the Lieberman clause of the Ketubah to secure a prior commitment from these two partners, and civil divorce, prenuptial agreement, all these sort of things that they are doing. In the absence of such agreements, our joint Beit Din arranges for Hakafat Kiddushin, annulment of marriage, to retroactively nullify the marriage so that the woman can remarry without a get, okay? In other words, this is between a man and a woman. There are traditional ideas of divorce, and what the conservative movement is doing, which the Reform Judaism did not do, is think from the other side to say, okay, we can marry them. What happens if gay and lesbians want to get divorced? Who gets the get? Who requires the get? Where do we stand on these sort of things? This was a hesitation that they had. Okay, Reform Judaism said it's Kiddushin, it's the same, and we don't do the get anymore, okay? Conservative Judaism, on the other hand, did and said, you have to think about it. You have to think about if two Jewish women need a divorce. According to traditional Jewish law, there needs to be a man involved. What do we do about it, okay? Finally, the very language of the traditional Jewish wedding ceremony liturgy and its documents, and likewise with the traditional Jewish divorce ceremony and its documents, is gender specific. We talked about this in the Reform view. Ours was an easy modification. You change man and woman to man and man. You change it to woman and woman. There's your gender neutral language. It is more difficult from a traditional halachic point of view for our conservative friends to simply change that. Neither fit same-sex couples. Because of these considerations, we have decided to create a new halachic structure for same-sex unions and separations that is fully egalitarian and that avoids the severe liabilities of the get. Do you see the difference, friends, as to what our conservative friends did? Reform Judaism said it's the same thing. All we have to do is change a couple words. The conservative movement said we're going to leave the heterosexual marriage ceremony the way it is, and what we're going to do is build something completely new for them. Okay? Our Psak Din, our legal ruling in the 2006 responsum, was intended to harmonize classical halachic norms regarding sexuality with the contemporary insights about sexual identity and the impact of the status quo ante upon the Jews who are gay and lesbian. Just as our halachic conclusion grew out of classical halachic sources, so too should our ceremonies and documents grow out of the sources of Jewish tradition. In other words, what they will build will also be built on Jewish tradition. It will simply not be built on the Kiddushin idea of heterosexual marriage, okay? So going back to the idea of what they said in the beginning, this now makes a great deal of sense in terms of the autonomy that they are providing for their rabbis to do. Rabbis can perform this new halachic built brand new liturgical aspect and statements and ceremony, or they can choose not to. You can see, hopefully, that why they needed to distinguish between that kind of autonomy, because just as hard as it would be to change traditional halachic law, it'd be very hard for some rabbis to say you can't just invent a brand new halachic ceremony. That's not tradition. This is new, right? The conservative movement, just like any movement, has its sort of spectrum of where people view in terms of that. Nowadays, in 2018, most, if not all, I'm not aware of any conservative rabbis who would not perform a same-sex marriage, but most will. but they have that option. If, they just disagree with it, they can say, go see Rabbi, this guy, he'll do it, but I can't do it.
What
Yes.
was the Orthodox pushback, let's say, the views of the conservative and the reform movement?
Next, that's next.
Thank you.
No problem. Yes.
Don't rabbis always have an out, like you don't have to marry anybody if you don't want to, right?
That's true. I have that sign. I reserve the right to refuse service to anybody. No, that is true. You are not obligated to do so for lots of reasons. And what is important is that whether you are gay or straight is typically not even an issue. More if it is, am I the right person to marry you? Does your marriage look stable? Are you doing it for the right reasons? All these sort of more in-depth questions are the reason why you might say we're a little hesitant. You're a little too young, you're a little too old, you're a little too weird, whatever. So, though that is true. So, yes, there are certainly many outs that we can say, just like, I just don't feel comfortable. Because what I always say to a couple is, my performing the ceremony isn't just a 15-minute gig. It's my name that I signed on your ketubah, which hangs on your wall for the rest of your life, and I'm investing in you, right? Which means that if you guys really mess up, they come back to me and say, what was wrong with you, Rabbi? How could you marry these people? Okay, so we don't want that, okay? To be fair, people get divorced, but that's not our, it's not our fault. But yes, we do have that option, okay? And that is an issue that comes up far more in this generation's rabbis when it comes into the idea of interfaith marriage. Okay, same-sex marriage in this generation's of rabbis is, look, are you two Jews? Great, wonderful. Interfaith, what?
Reforming conservative rabbis.
Correct. Reforming conservative rabbis. Thank you. Correct. When it comes to interfaith, it is a much more distinct sort of issue in terms of even within the reform movement. There's all kinds of in fact, there was a survey that was done throughout the denominations and throughout reform rabbis. There's only, I think, 80-something% will always say yes to an interfaith marriage, or will say yes to an interfaith marriage if certain conditions are met. There's a whole 20% of us out there who, not us, of them out there who will just say no. But every generation has that sort of one question, right? 20 years ago, it was same sex, right? Interfaith marriage wasn't as big a deal. Same sex marriage was. It reversed, right? Now it's all about, well, I don't know, that sort of thing. So yes, it's complicated, right? Signing your name on someone's marriage certificate is an investment. So we want to make the best decisions possible. Okay? Yeah.
Kind of non-related, because we got married once in the church, once in the temple. The minister was okay to do one service with the rabbi refused.
Yep.
Is that
Happens.
Do you have a view on that?
Me
Yes.
personally, or me
Yes,
from a
curious,
reform point of view?
curious on whether you-
I've done ceremonies with Catholic priests, with Lutheran Methodists. I've done them with Hindu and Muslim and whatever. I mean, like, it doesn't matter. As long as what's important to me personally as a rabbi is Judaism going to be a part of your life? If it is, then I should be there.
Yeah,
If it's
you met
not,
with the
what am I doing there?
rabbi.
Right.
You met with both. You met with Methodist.
And that is true. And that is true. Right.
So when we got divorced, we used to joke, 'cause when we got wrong.
Right.
After we got that, but maybe we really weren't divorced, because you get married twice, maybe you have to get divorced twice.
Yeah. That is, you know, right.
Once is enough.
Right, and even if, by the way, Dan, to let you know, even if a rabbi does agree to an interfaith marriage, there are some that will disagree to do a joint marriage ceremony. There's liturgy and theology and things like that say, well, I can't really do that if he's going to bless you with Jesus' name. I can't really be there, part of that, right, or whatever it is. Usually, what has happened, at least in my case, is that we sit down with the other person and we say, look, you can't do the J-man. And I won't say anything about only being Jewish, and then we get along. But yes, so that is very much an autonomous issue. I mean, there are rabbis who will go all across and say, yes, I'll do this one, but not this one, and all kinds of other stuff.
Hear that you are open to.
I'm open.
individual situations.
As long as Judaism is a part of your life, then I should be there. If it's not, call your priest or whatever. You know, I don't need to be there. All right, so we have covered Reform and Conservative. Let us cover our Orthodox friends, okay? Overall, Orthodox Jews on the whole continue to reject homosexual behavior as fundamentally inconsistent with Jewish law. Remember that there is a wide range of orthodoxy, okay, from the first class. We're talking about there's modern orthodoxy all the way to ultra orthodoxy, okay? So when we say on the whole, okay, most of those denominations on the whole reject homosexual behavior as fundamentally inconsistent with Jewish law. While there's little indication that this position is severely contested within that community, let alone likely to change in the near future, there have been initiatives to make Orthodox communities more welcoming of gay Jews. Now that is true. Certainly within the modern Orthodox views, they have tried very hard in modern Orthodoxy to make sure that gay and lesbian Jews feel that they can be a part of Jewish ceremonies, feel that they can be part of Jewish worship, that they are welcome. This does not mean that they will marry them. They will just welcome them into their midst, okay? A statement authored by 2010 and signed by over 200 Orthodox rabbis expressly welcomed gay Jews fully into synagogue life, even as it reiterated traditional Orthodox opposition to gay sex and same-sex marriage. An Israeli Orthodox rabbinic group released a similar statement in 2016, and a number of grassroots groups for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender Orthodox Jews and their families have emerged, including JQY and Eshel. Great organizations, by the way. Eshel is a wonderful, beautiful organization that really does help to work on the tension between traditional Orthodoxy understanding of homosexuality and the welcoming of Jews into their midst, okay?
Those international groups in America or?
These are mostly national groups, but they do extend internationally. Really important, though, is the Israeli aspect, answered back with this sort of way. And in Israel, there is huge gay pride and all these sort of things. That is 90% of Jews in Israel are fully supportive of gay marriage. That 10% of the ultra-Orthodox are extremely against it. So you will see that sort of tension. Yes, Gary?
So when we're talking about welcoming gay Jews into the Orthodox community, is this, you recognize that you are gay and accept, we might see it as a lifestyle, but we accept your lifestyle, or is this like in certain Christian denominations where it's like, we accept you, but we realize this is a burden you have to carry, and in theory,
It depends.
you shouldn't actually be gay.
It depends. On the more ultra-Orthodox fundamental side, there are conversion therapy, there are prayer situations and things like that, trying to release them from that sort of stuff. In the modern Orthodoxy, who do understand science and that sort of stuff, they say, look, we're strapped by halakha. We can't change this, but you're still Jewish and we still want you with us, if that makes sense, okay?
Don't act on it.
Right. That being said, there is a huge underground, even ultra-Orthodox gay community, which tries very hard to survive and get together, okay? Okay. I wanted to bring the Rabbinical Council, meaning this is the Orthodox version of the CCAR, and their response to 2015's Supreme Court ruling, okay? We saw Reform Judaism, which was big deal. We already thought this was fine. Conservative, which was great, wonderful. We support you. Now we got our own stuff to do. And here is the Orthodox, which you can see, protest against it, okay? So we can see already where this is going, okay? The Rabbinical Council of America expresses deep concern over today's ruling of the Supreme Court of the United States regarding same-sex marriage. While recognizing the civil rights of all who live in a democratic country, as well as the diversity of religious and political opinions in a multi-religious society, the RCA, meaning the Rabbinical Council of America, rejects the court's redefinition of marriage. Marriage is an institution defined by the Bible and subsequent religious codes, and is upon the foundation of traditional family life that our society has been built for millennia. This is an opinion, okay? This is a rabbinic opinion, okay, that you are reading, all right? They are saying this is why we reject this idea, meaning they have to follow the law, right? It is the law of the land, but they reject the very definition that the secular courts have stated, okay? We are sobered by the response of Chief Justice John Roberts that, quote, people of faith can take no comfort in the treatment they receive from the majority today, end quote, and are alarmed about the threat articulated by Justice Alito, that the majority opinion will be used to vilify Americans who are unwilling to assent to the new orthodoxy. In the course of its opinion, the majority compares traditional marriage laws to laws that denied equal treatment of African Americans and women. The implications of this analogy will be exploited by those who are determined to stamp out every vestige of dissent. Okay? Here they are taking some very particular quotes to say this is what we are concerned about. Okay? We call on the United States government to ensure, in the words of Justice Anthony Kennedy, that religious organizations and persons are given proper protection as they seek to teach principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faith. In other words, friends, they say, okay, we can't do anything about the fact that this is the law. What we can hope, however, is that the government will protect us when we say we worry that we will be forced to do things outside of our religious boundaries, outside of our religious integrity. That the government will say, even though it's the law, we understand your hesitation and you don't necessarily have to do that. Okay, that's very hard in terms of secular legal language, to say nothing of religious legal language. Okay, that's why there's all these court cases now about religious freedom and all the things that constitute religious freedom, if rejection of a customer is a religious freedom or not. This is what they are trying to say. They're trying to say, we don't want to do this. We know it's the law. We hope that you understand that and protect that about ourselves. Okay, right?
Like, I was just wondering if you could, you call it whether, like, a one sentence, like, summary of what Alito's finding or summary was that kind of prompted that response, saying that from Kennedy, saying that we don't follow that certain things will happen or certain behaviors. I was just kind of wondering.
I mean, I don't have the full transcript of their statements, but what they're latching onto here is the fear that when there is a law that is passed that is this controversial, that those who disagree will be vilified, right? And here is a like bakers who won't bake, right? They will be vilified, right? So here the Orthodox is saying we're afraid we're going to be vilified because we don't agree. We publicly don't agree, right? Okay. So we're worried that that will be a repercussion, not necessarily legal, but it will eventually spill over into the legal world.
Okay.
Okay. The president of the RCA said we remind all Americans of faith, Jewish and non-Jewish, that no court can change God's immutable law. That is not true. Okay. Dina de Malchut Dina does exactly that. Okay. Every court in the land can override religious rulings. That is simply the world we live in. So this again is an opinion. Okay. We will redouble our efforts to use persuasion to make the case for God's eternal truths, their eternal truths, about the nuclear family, their view of the nuclear family, and the bond between husband and wife. We stand committed not to lose faith in faith itself and hope that others who cherish God's teaching will join us. Okay. From an Orthodox point of view, it's very Orthodox. Okay. From a reform point of view, there are lots of things about this statement that we disagree. Okay, lots of things in terms of the very definition of family, of couples, of love, of faith, of God's truth, all these sort of things. These are one of the huge aspects as to why when someone says, why does the Orthodox not like gay marriage and you do? It is not a one sentence answer, okay? It is a many pages and pages and pages of understanding deeply from terminology and those sorts of things. Yes, George.
Are the Orthodox against polygamy?
Yes, they are.
But there was polygamy in Judaism.
Correct. But then the Talmud ruled it out.
So the Talmud ruled it out.
Right, yeah. Yeah, the laws of the Torah are like a tiny speck of law. The volumes and volumes of the Talmud basically said, no, this is the ruling. So.
Okay, so the Talmud ruled out polygamy, but didn't rule out the abomination of homosexuality.
No, and no, and that was harder because for them, for our Orthodox friends, it is an explicit textual reference in the Torah and Leviticus, right? Polygamy is simply a behavior of the biblical aspects. And again, Dina de Malchut Dina, if you live in a world where the law of the land is no polygamy, you can one, you can't do it because it's illegal, and you have to accept that. Yeah.
Is there any organization that conservatives, Reformed and Orthodox belong to?
You mean in general
Yeah,
that all those denominations belong to?
yeah. Put another way, do the Orthodox accept us as Jews?
No. That's a different question, though. You will find members of all denominations as to be members of J Street, and what's the other one? What's the Israeli APAC, right? That will extend denominations. That being said, from an Orthodox point of view, certainly from an ultra-Orthodox point of view, I don't want to speak the wrong way. From an ultra-Orthodox point of view, our interpretation of Judaism and lives as Jews does not qualify. Our rabbinic rules on marriage and conversion do not qualify as realistic.
So there's no
Not just
organization
Reform,
in the United States that all
No.
face.
They don't make us get along.
No. Right. Because, Jules, of these things that we're talking about, there are certainly organizations that work together, right, to fight things like, the poor and homelessness and drug addiction and these sort of things that will certainly partner in those ways. But there are far too many distinctions from a theological and terminological point of
But
view.
there's no organization that speaks then for all.
No, definitely not.
The Federation would be the closest though, right, in terms of, but not in terms of policy, just in terms of support.
Maybe yes, maybe no,
I mean, like,
depending
they'll
on,
give money to most, like,
yeah, but no, there is no organization that speaks for every denomination of Judaism.
I spokesman didn't realize that Jews accept the secular law over the.
That's a Talmudic rabbinic interpretation.
I've heard that some countries want to outlaw circumcision.
Yeah,
What happens in a case like that? You have any idea?
that is a rabbinic problem. You will see pages and pages and pages about it.
Like you and Rufus.
But Dina de Malchut will come up, is to say, this is the law of the land, what do we do about it? We can't just break the law, right? Jews just don't go out and break the law. We have to find ways around it, right? We either fight for the law to be changed, or we send them to a country that does do. I mean, there's ways around that.
Creative Reform Judaism.
Correct.
so we just adopt the, like,
The Hatafat Breed? Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that'll work.
Well, even with the cemetery situation, when we thought,
Right.
we tried to say, hey, why don't we all just be one Jewish cemetery? And my naivete on their rules of what they do with burials and the reform made that not.
Correct.
That didn't fly.
Correct. Exactly. In every aspect of life and death, there are
Very
roadblocks.
different.
And that is that again at every one of these classes, right? I have to always put down that idea is that when someone asks you that question, why can't we all get along? There's lots of reasons why. It's not that we aren't nice to each other. We can be very pleasant and nice to each other, like we were this morning. We all want religious education, but there are so many of these very, very hard lines and lines in the sand that we will not cross, and they will not cross, and that's important to recognize. Okay. Yeah.
So last class, you said the thing about really reading language and that being really important. So my question is, in Leviticus, it says like man should not lie with another man. So how do they universalize that if they were so specific about, it said like, if your son does this, whatever.
Right. You're right. It's a great question for an Orthodox rabbi. And I will ask him, my buddy. But my guess is what they would expound upon in terms of that interpretation is that if it's wrong for one, it's wrong for the other. Or the fact that it does not even exist in the Torah means that it does not exist and that you should not do it, basically. If there is no law even regarding lesbian anything, it is to be from an Orthodox point of view that it simply it's not possible, and simply is they're wrong. But that is just my guess, knowing from what I understand of Orthodox interpretation. I will find out and get back to you as to what they say.
just be interesting.
I'm interested too. I'm interested too.
Google that,
Yeah.
Laura Schlesinger, Dr. Laura Schlesinger and gay marriage. I'm trying to find it, but he literally, he pulled out everything and did a double take on it and twisted it. It was pretty good.
Yeah. There, if you read our commentaries on those verses, not just in the Plout commentary, but the women's commentary is really important to read on that sort of stuff. The Jewish Study Bible, you'll see some of those sort of pushback and scriptural understandings and interpretations. Okay, let's end this class with the Same-Sex Marriage Statement of Principle. This was from the Rabbinical Council of America, which is one section. The Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America is their version of the URJ, reaffirming the following foundational principles and beliefs in unambiguous and unmistakable terms. Okay, in other words, their version of the CCAR and their version of the URJ came together for a statement so that no one would be unclear as to where Orthodoxy stands. Homosexual behavior is and always has been absolutely forbidden by Jewish law and tradition. Any attempt to characterize Jewish law and tradition to the contrary must be rejected. The only legitimate form of sexual behavior is that which takes place between an adult men and women within the sacred institution of marriage as traditionally defined and permitted. Under no circumstances can Jewish tradition or law countenance a notion of so-called same-sex marriage, rituals, or status under religious auspices. In our view, the term marriage, by its very definition, cannot be construed or applied to same-sex relationships. To do so is to deprive the term of its fundamental and defining meaning. The institution of marriage and family life, as defined in practice for thousands of years as between a man and a woman, a father and a mother, respectively, is far too important and essential to the bedrock of society and civilization as we know it, to thus be undermined by those who presume to redefine its essence. At the same time, we reaffirm that those who, in spite of their acceptance of these principles, have difficulty in living up to these standards, they should be treated with compassion, sensitivity, and understanding in our synagogues, in the Jewish community, and society at large. We further note that Passover, commemorating the Exodus from Egypt, is an especially appropriate time to reaffirm these principles, as Leviticus 18 makes clear that the liberation was not only from slavery and infanticide, but also from the sexual depravity practiced by the ancient Egyptians, which is understood by the sages of blessed memory, included the legitimization of same-sex marriages. We thus call upon our fellow Jews and fellow citizens to stand opposed to any attempt, whether judicial, legislative, or religious in nature, to bestow the sanctity of marriage upon the same-sex couples. There is lots that I disagree with in this statement. Okay, there are lots that conservative Judaism disagrees with and Reform Judaism disagrees with and other denominations of Judaism disagrees with. However, you can see in unambiguous and unmistakable terms where modern Orthodoxy stands on this, to say nothing of ultra-Orthodoxy, which has very much not even had to put out a statement because we know the statement, okay? I did not print out anything from Chabad.org, but those questions are rare to Chabad, and when they are answered, they are not answered well. So this, however, I'd like to make a point. I want to make sure that we understand and respect their understanding and decision and all of that. However, I want you to look into the language as to what they're saying, okay? One, they're saying that homosexual behavior always has been absolutely forbidden by Jewish law. That is true, that Jewish law has always forbidden that particular homosexual behavior. By tradition is not necessarily true. By their interpretation of tradition, it has not been, okay?
Say it again.
By tradition, it has not been. By Jewish law, it has been. Meaning that homosexual behavior has occurred and has been accepted within tradition throughout the Tanakh and later, okay? Jewish law has always been forbidden on it, okay? They are defining marriage, the English word marriage here, okay? That in itself is problematic, but I understand what they're trying to do. If they are saying that the term itself, marriage, is between a man and a woman, there's not much farther you can go with that. They will not call marriage anything else. There is a different interpretation of the word marriage. There's all kinds of different interpretations of the word marriage. This is theirs, okay? The idea that the institution of marriage and family life as defined in practice for thousands of years as between a man and a woman, a father and mother, in my opinion is naive. There have been plenty throughout, not just in Judaism, but across history, of relationships that have been same-sex, whether they have been accepted or whether they have been acknowledged or whatever it is. We can't trace as much, but to say that this is how it's been practiced by everyone for thousands of years is simply untrue. The idea that it says at the same time, those in spite of their acceptance of these principles have difficulty to living up to these standards is the Orthodoxy's way of saying that homosexuality is a choice. Okay, and the fact that you're just not trying hard enough. Okay. It's nice that they want to treat those people with compassion and sensitivity and understanding, but through that view, I see that's very difficult. Finally, their understanding that the idea of Leviticus 18, which does not state anything about homosexual behavior, is interpreted by the sages in Sifra Leviticus, meaning in the Midrash of Leviticus, the 2nd century to 3rd century text. The rabbis said, even though it doesn't say this in the Torah, this is what they meant in the Torah, is questionable because it is one rabbi's decision to say that. There's no other source to back that up. The idea of the sanctity of marriage, well, you can see that conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism believe that the sanctity of marriage can extend beyond this, okay? I'm not trying to pick on our Orthodox friends. I want to let you know that, again, this isn't just a black and white issue. There are terminology issues, there are interpretation issues, there are views of history that are different, some accurate, some inaccurate, okay? There are narrow views as to legitimacy of things. That is very, in my opinion, problematic. In the same way, when we study anything, right? If we are looking at the Torah through the eyes of the Talmudic rabbis from the 2nd to the 5th century, the 5th century person does not know what a 21st century person knows. So we had to, as Reform Jews and even conservative Jews, reevaluate what some of these rulings were made, okay? The Orthodox will not do that. They will say, this is what was said, this is holy, this is it. So they will find themselves even more boxed in than our conservative friends in regards to traditional halacha in this way. Okay?
The Torah is full of men having relations with their wife, with their handmaidens.
Oh, sure.
concubines.
Yeah.
Were they considered marriage or not?
No. The marriage was, as the conservative view, it was the ring, the contract, and the sexual appropriation, procreation, or whatever it is. So once, if you mate with your handmaiden, you have to actually marry them. That's a different step. You can procreate with them, but you can't marry. You have to marry them.
Were they married or not?
No, they weren't married. I mean, they were married to their wife. They weren't married to the handmaiden.
Well, at one time could a man have more than one wife?
Yes, but that was outlawed. That was outlawed.
That was just outlawed.
Yeah, in rabbinic world, in the rabbinic law. Yeah.
In what, the 2nd century is it?
Yeah, around the Talmud, 2nd and 5th century. Yeah.
So then the begetting in the Bible or whatever does not necessarily mean
Beget does not necessarily mean marriage.
marriage,
Just means
that someone's born.
correct.
Or recognized from a marriage. No, it's just
No, not necessarily. Plenty of procreation occurred in our Torah and Tanakh that was not through marriage.
So since the Talmud outlawed polygamy, had the Talmud endorsed homosexual marriage in theory or
In theory, Orthodoxy would say yes, because the Talmud, they believe, was the oral law that was whispered to Moses on Mount Sinai and holds just as much holiness and law as the Torah itself. So if there was a majority opinion in the Talmud that said it was fine, then Orthodoxy would say it says this, it's fine. It doesn't.
I'm missing something from the Orthodox point of view. If polygamy was part of ancient Jewish practice,
Yes.
why isn't that halacha?
Lots of reasons. That's a whole nother thing. But a lot happens between the 2nd century and the 21st century. There's a great deal that goes into it, and that's
But
a
just
whole
between the
nother.
2nd and the
Well,
ancient.
2nd and 5th century is the Mishnah and the Talmud. So within those rabbinic words, they either outlawed polygamy, or they said that's no longer, we no longer do it, or whatever it is. I actually haven't studied that a great deal, but I know that it's outlawed now. So,
I guess what I'm trying to say, if they got outlawed in the 5th century, they still wouldn't agree to outlawing something in the 20th century.
no. No, something that the rabbis and the sages of the 5th century in the Talmud were whispered to Moses, according to Orthodox. Nothing is whispered anymore from God anymore, right? So
It
now
doesn't
it's
make
just
sense, does it?
now it's just rabbinic interpretation, okay, instead of law. So as you move forward from the Talmud into things like Shulchan Aruch and all these other things, they're simply interpretations of the law that's already there. But what they would say is there's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new that is coming. Only
Well, when
new
you say-
interpretations.
I'm ignorant here. When they say the law, what are they talking about?
The law,
Yeah.
it's a big question. They are talking about the law code that states what is halakha.
And the law code is, what century was that?
All throughout the centuries. Okay, so that could mean Mishnah, Talmud. It could mean Shulchan Aruch, which was 16th century. It could mean new law codes that are reinterpreted and redone.
So,
Okay.
so theoretically, it could still be changed.
Yes, in theory, the most traditional thing a Jew can do is change. So we do change things, but there are certain things that they will not change on, and certain things we won't change on. So it's a little more complicated. But hopefully, friends, this gives you at least a basic idea of where we stand on this particular one tiny issue. All right, friends, let's take 5 minutes, and then we'll start our next class. Okay?
This post is really good on Leviticus. Quotes.
See you later. Oh, no.
Okay, so Dr. Lawrence.
She was involved in
It says,
religious
I know from
rules.
Leviticus 11:6 to 8,
Fundraiser
touching the
today.
skin of a dead pig.
Sounds like
makes me
you're
unclean,
very,
but I still
very
like
upset
football
about
wearing
that.
gloves.
Yeah.
A friend of mine.
I think it was part of law, they took it out.
Sabbath.
They can change it, they can change
I
it
slept
again.
in a little bit. So I think there were 6 alarms. I
Yeah.
missed 6
Oh,
alarms.
yes, exactly.
But the radio is on so loud, I don't hear the other alarms.
There's a great
Just kept getting up.
Yeah.
Yeah, just kept getting.
Is there any iced tea in the refrigerator or anything?
There should be food in there from this morning.
I just want to
Ooh.
drink something.
Oh, well, let's see.
Yeah, okay, I gotta go take care of a little old lady. I cannot sit.
When did you see Anna last?
Oh, about a week and a half ago, I agitated her. I opened the cards to read them to her because she had a bunch of, yeah, the staff. So I said to the staff, I think she's uncomfortable, and they said, we just got uncomfortable. What are you doing? It was probably about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. It was
She really
time.
does.
It was time. You know, it's sad that somebody who has went through so much in life suffers in the end. You think they'd suffered enough, you know? But it
Well,
was
I always say
time.
there's 2 bad times in life. Coming into it and going out of it. You come in at the beach end, but, you know.
Well, but look at all, you know, I was lucky because my parents, it really was fast, although at the time you don't feel that it's fast. But, you know, a month and a half is nothing. Look what you went through.
Just go back in there and
So,
get your own
yeah.
tea, mister.
There's some tea in the
Oh, there's carnashes in there for all of you.
Debbie's
It's a big Hebrew letter? Okay. Black and blue, that's blue. This one we left out. Oh, well. Oh, well.
I think we're all right.
Oh, well. Can we do your name in Hebrew? No.
What are you doing now, Jen?
Oh, I gotta go help a little old lady that's going out of town. Yeah, so a lot of the stuff gets too into my mind anyway. I can handle this class. I like it. Some of the others, my knowledge. I get too confused.
So still
Really?
five.
You're doing great, Jan.
Thank you.
You're doing great.
I mean,
right?
like, yeah, it's like, I mean, I have those words like Torah, Talmud, this, but the hierarchy is which group, which baby grill I don't want to have.
It is difficult to teach this in an hour. It is very hard to do that. There's so many,
I like
incongruities.
reform because of its flexibility and social justice and its ways of getting around stuff.
When
Yeah.
when you're talking about the marriage stuff, so we had a Reform rabbi who refused to marry us,
Really?
even though Kelly was all finished with conversion classes. She just had to do the mikvah, and he was like, "No, it's an interfaith marriage. I won't do it."
And see, we didn't have to say
It was just like
anything.
crazy because we
Go dip in the mikvah and then come over. I mean, like what?
Yeah,
Like, what's the?
whole reason was we couldn't get a mikvah date at the
For reform?
Yeah.
I'll send you to the ocean.
Right?
I mean,
It was
like,
crazy.
See, all
We
we
had
had to
someone-
do was
we had a
attend some
rabbi
classes to learn about Judaism. My fiance went with me. I went
Yeah.
to training to be a Methodist. They knew I wasn't going to church. We knew he wasn't.
I mean,
That's
I
awful. I feel so bad.
Well, we had a rabbi marry us, but he came from 3 hours away instead of an hour.
sad. Oh my God.
Yes.
we're married.
Yeah, we're married. We have it.
But you could have been really turned off by it. You could have
Say bye-bye to everyone.
Say
bye-bye. What? Thank you for studying with us.
He's been very-
ceremony and then getting married,
Yeah,
like
but
games
still.
on a computer.
Yeah, but it's still pretty good.
Will you go home and get the house ready for Hanukkah?
That is so
But
sad.
When is Hanukkah tomorrow?
Tonight.
Yes,
Tonight, first candle.
Yeah, first candle tonight.
Is
You
it?
like the candle?
First candle tonight.
Yeah.
You like the candle?
I'm glad,
Jules is such a bad dude. He really
Oh,
is.
really?
I keep saying to him, when is it? So first candle tonight.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, it turned us off that
We didn't
particular.
have-
And tell me, when you
you
when you were little, when did you get presents?
And as soon as we.
My family got them at Christmas because my mother was not Jewish.
Okay, so you woke up Christmas morning and you got presents.
Mhm.
So Santa came to Jewish children.
In our household, he did, to
That's a
South
good
Ninth Street.
question.
Yeah.
Thank God.
It's a-
Yeah, Jules is a bit awful. Like, Santa's not Christian. I know he's
prayer
still
book.
Christianity, but I think Santa just comes to children. So I can imagine Jewish children waking up and thinking, why doesn't Santa come to me?
But Jewish children traditionally get a present a night.
And now to that, listen, you see, it's Hanukkah tonight. It starts Hanukkah tonight.
First candle tonight.
Glad it didn't turn you guys off.
So when do you wait? Would you get presents tonight?
She was going to.
One each night.
If the Hanukkah fairy comes.
One.
Hanukkah goes tonight
Yeah.
and tomorrow night.
Yep.
And the next 8 nights.
Yep, next date.
Yay! You better go to the.
At least a joke about people.
At least one.
At least one.
no,
Yay! Did you get that as well, or you just got Christmas?
Just like Christmas, yeah. I mean, my-
So this was
The Bible Belt.
there was a Jewish
this
family
was a copy of
in my,
yeah.
that carpooled to Sunday school. From Lafayette to Sunday school in West Lafayette, and the Morris family moved from King Street in Lafayette to West Lafayette. So my mother didn't have anyone to trade off driving, and she didn't have the support of another mother and another set of Jewish children that wanted to go to Sunday school. So we dropped out.
Yeah.
Bye,
See
Jan.
you again.
Good to see you.
We will see each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we
Light the candles tonight.
we were living in Indiana, but we wanted to get married in Missouri.
I thought it was starting tomorrow night.
Closest.
Tomorrow's the first day.
First day.
Where was
tomorrow.
the-
Yeah.
Was it
He was
today
nice
that
about it.
the
He was like,
celebration
no,
of the
I
first night of Hanukkah in Temple, was that this morning?
No, that's on
No.
Friday night. We've got
Friday night's a
Hanukkah
special
Shabbat.
one. Yeah, special.
Friday?
This Friday night, you know.
Coming.
6 o'clock.
Yes, I know that.
And
But
then,
today's Sunday.
Well, I don't
so
care.
we ended up-
I'm just looking at the calendar. The calendar says on Friday night we've got Hanukkah Shabbat. haven't we? 6
Right,
o'clock.
and I think we're gonna have latkes.
So we're gonna have potato pancakes.
Oh, I
Is that
hope
what they are?
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be nice if we had kugel again. Oh, gosh.
Oh,
I
that
love
kugel at Anna's funeral was beautiful. Someone put apple in it.
Oh,
It's lovely. I made Google and it was, I could have,
Cool.
it
Well,
was
you know-
hard.
we can make it again and again and again until we get the combination that we adore.
Mine was too hard. Too dry.
But it's got a lot of great, like, really fattening things in it.
All right.
So does Asher get a present tonight?
He does get a present tonight.
Okay, so tell me,
Does Barry get one too?
Jules is so bad.
Barry's
at
already gotten
explaining this to me. Like in Jules is making all of this up. And basically, no one got any presents ever in the Janet family, which is just.
Oh.
Oh, yeah, a strictly
Yeah.
Maccabees version
Yeah.
of
So-
Hanukkah?
So tonight, Asher will,
You
or
will
will you
get
wake
a-
up in the morning?
No, he'll get it tonight.
So you get one present tonight,
Right.
and one tomorrow night?
He'll get 8 presents.
Okay.
Yes.
And who brings that? Do you bring it or the Hanukkah fairy?
Oh, I bring it. We bring it, not Hanukkah Harry. No.
Yeah, the Hanukkah fairy was made up.
Yeah,
No, that was made up in my,
yeah. Hanukkah Harry was a thing that was made up in honor of you.
Oh, was it? Okay,
well,
Right, no bench on the bench, okay? So-
all right. So will you give, now, just one more question, will you give Barry a present tonight too?
Will I what?
Will you give Barry a present tonight?
Barry and I have already given each other big presents.
A big
So,
present.
What did you get?
I'm giving her a baby moon in California, at Spa. It's a baby moon.
What's it?
Yes, my sweetheart.
It's the new rage now.
What's a baby moon?
You go on vacation when you're pregnant before the baby's born.
Oh, a baby moon.
Yeah, we went to.
I'll move the baby.
Where did you go?
to Toronto for our baby moon.
cool.
Yeah, well,
It was for a conference.
it was,
I
but we
just-
went
Baby moon, I
Yeah.
guess.
Well, that's.
Okay, friends.
I've not lived there.
So, since my son refuses to leave my side, we will stay. I'm gonna sit next to you. You want to sit on my lap? That's fine. All right, friends. Does everyone have a copy? Okay. For this class, we have been, again, over the past few sessions, looking at the Torah, specifically the book of Genesis, not from a theological point of view, but from a literary criticism point of view. So once again, to our friends who believe that the Torah is divine and perfect and came from Mount Sinai, that is perfectly fine. We are simply not discussing that theology today. Today, we are going to continue our discussion of the book of Genesis through the idea of literary criticism, the idea of multiple authorships, and how those stories and legends of the Near East were redacted and edited to give theological rise to monotheism and Judaism in general. Okay? Last time, we talked about certain themes that exist inside of Genesis. We talked about if we remove some of those edited additions to even stories such as our Garden of Eden story, we see a great deal of Near Eastern legend, paganism, these sorts of ideas of multiple gods, the ideas of where humanity stands, all these things that we can see were pulled, borrowed from Near Eastern understanding, meaning Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Amorite, Canaanite, all these other things that were surrounded the biblical authors, the Torah authors, pulled in and then manipulated to be through their understanding, okay? As we talked about last time, we think about the book of Genesis as a crate of eggs, right? When you close the crate of eggs, everything seems very secure, everything looks all ready to go. However, if you open up the crate of eggs, each one of those eggs is its own individual story that can be removed and is simply set down and guided together as to what we call the ideological overlay. The ideological overlay, once again, is exactly as it sounds, an ideology that weaves these stories together so that one, they fit from a chronological point of view, but two, it's okay, but two, so that the theology of one attempts to, it's not always 100%, but attempts to match the theology of the others. Are we all with us? Are we all together? Are you with me? Okay. So we're going to, again, look at some of these aspects of the book of Genesis and the Torah writings from ancient civilizations. In the scholarly opinion, it is impossible, certainly not the correct way, to look at any ancient document without perhaps the influence that may have occurred from the other ancient documents that surrounded it, the other theological views and belief systems that surrounded it. Just like we would today, we are all susceptible to our own influence of what we call the cultural repertoire. Our cultural repertoire is a creation of all the things we incorporate into our own culture, our own assumptions, our own idiomatic expressions, all of those things where if another culture, either from a different geographical point or from a different timeline, would look back, they'd need to study and say, this is a part of this particular culture. It's not a part of ours. We need to understand it correctly. The metaphor or the example, rather, that I always go back to is that of Shakespeare, and that you need a teacher to guide you through the words of Shakespeare. You can't just open it up and think you understand all the idiomatic expressions, the language, and things like that. You need a helper to get you through that. You have to remember, despite all of the views that say you can open up a Bible and just be great, wonderful, and interpret it, right? That if you do so, you are missing some of those idiomatic expressions, some of those aspects of that cultural repertoire, many cultural repertoires in terms of the multiple authorships, their agendas, their views, their hopes and wishes. So we have to give a good in-depth study to make sure we don't miss anything, okay? So that's a nice brief overview of where we are, where we're moving, okay? When we look at ancient civilizations, and we're talking about ancient civilizations from not just ours, of course, of ancient Israelite, but Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Egyptian, all of that, they are typically defined by a sojourn to a designated land, meaning there is, at a certain point, some group migrates to another place and calls it home, okay? To a governance structure, okay, that was at once autonomous and indigenous. Either this is where we are, we have a connection to the land, or we build a structure, meaning a kingdom or a set of tribes or a country, right? 3 is a religion, typically organized by well-defined cultic sites, meaning sacrificial ideas. When we talk about the cultic aspects of our ancient religion, the idea of ritual objects, ritual movements, and that sort of thing, usually administered by a priestly guild or a caste, meaning there is some group that has a better understanding of that religion and is in charge of doing it correct, whether you call them priests or a guild or that particular caste or that particular tribe or whatever it is. In one form or the other, all ancient civilizations were typically defined by those 3 things, okay? One or the other, or all 3, 2 out of 3, whatever it is. They had those aspects together, okay? We would realize then, of course, that the smaller, what we would call nations of the ancient world would usually be gone, usually either be conquered by a larger force, or they'd be incorporated, marry into another one, they'd be swallowed up, and basically they would leave little traces of their existence underneath sands of history, meaning that when big empires like the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Roman Empire came about in the ancient world, they would swallow up all these other cultures and either integrate them into their own, or others would sort of marry in or genealogically add in. In fact, one of the scholarly ideas as to how the Israelite people came to be, at one point, the majority in the land of Canaan was not conquering at all, but simply just living there and grew and swallowed up the other cultures. The Tanakh tells us that we went and eradicated all of them through mass genocide, which is not very good, but most scholarly and archaeological evidence points to a much more slow and peaceful transition. In terms of the smaller nations, we should mention that we don't really see or hear about Jebusites, Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Canaanites anymore. You don't see Canaanites walking down the street anymore. So these are these ancient other nations that are just gone. They're just gone. Yeah.
Were they real or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. These other tribes and other peoples. There is archaeological evidence to point that they did exist, and that many of the I'll have to say this, many of the names that we call them in the Torah are not particularly accurate. There are interpretation of it, but there is evidence to say that they did exist. There's actually fascinating research about the idea of the Philistines. The Philistines, which were, we believe, an Aegean sort of Greek sea people that were always on the waters, and so when Abraham had to walk around to avoid them, that actually was possibly a real fear of the author that these sort of pirate people were there. Eventually, they came in and conquered. That's actually historically accurate. So it's very cool to see that kind of stuff that happened. One thing that we will mention as we get later is in terms of what distinguished the Israelite community. One thing I always like to point to, that was one of the favorite things I ever learned when I was studying archaeology in Israel, is that if you put Canaanite archaeology next to Israelite archaeology, there is literally no difference. The only difference between Canaanite and Israelite history is the Torah, the active literature. Okay, if you look at their pottery, if you look at their setups, things like that, it is literally the same, meaning that you could see that either one broke off from another, or that there was one particular group which followed the idea of the Torah and one didn't. And we see that the Canaanites, again, are gone, just like Amorites and all these sort of other things. Now, we also understand that some of them aren't just gone, right? They have evolved into other nations, or they have evolved and moved into other aspects of the world. Certainly, there are people in this world who claim that certain races or nations or whatever it is date back to these sort of ancient civilizations, which is its own study and that sort of stuff. But the idea is that for the most part, most of these small, tiny nations that existed in antiquity were either swallowed up or conquered. The difference was us, okay? Yes?
I want to see the others that have survived. Israel, who is this group in Israel who, what's their name again? It's not Druids. What is it?
The Druze?
Druze, yeah.
Okay.
Druze.
Yeah, Druze have their own.
DRUSE.
Yeah, the Druze. They have their own
Do
entire
they still
history.
have a priestly class and a book?
No, they're a what do you call them? Migratory. What do you call them? Nomadic group.
But it's not a religion.
Druze
Yeah.
are. I don't know enough about them to
How about
distinguish them as a nation.
Then there's Zoroaster.
Zoroastrian is gone.
They're completely gone.
Yeah, Zoroastrian is an ancient view. Actually, there's a lot of interaction between Zoroastrian and Israelite religion, but no, they're gone. Most of the other peoples within the Middle East have their own origin stories and how they got to Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and all, and Persian and all that sort of stuff that have nothing to do with.
I guess what I'm trying to
with
ask, are the Jews actually unique in people that have survived?
Some would say so. Some would say so in many ways, but there are plenty of other nations that have survived in some form or some way, or evolved into some way. And it's hard to say that we haven't evolved in some way. We're not the same Israelites in that way. So what I will say is that we survived conquest multiple times, unlike others. And we survived the millennia of frequent persecutions, okay? And we did not get swallowed up. But we were a small nation. That's what makes us
Okay, now
distinguishing.
Samaritans,
Yeah,
are they a group?
not anymore.
They're gone. They're completely
anymore.
gone.
Yeah, not anymore. Yeah. So the manner also in which distinguished the Jews is different. We were not along the margins of civilizations or remote regions like some of these other small ones. We developed independent cultures while remaining engaged in the cultural and economic structure of our host societies. In other words, while other cultures integrated into the kingdoms in which they were taken, we remained independent. Okay, while Assyria and Babylonia and Egypt and all these large kingdoms would sort of remove the identity of these small nations, the Jewish people, the Israelites, fought against that and developed their own independent subculture wherever they lived, meaning whether it was in the land of Canaan, whether it was outside in the diaspora, whether it was in the Rhineland or in Russia or in America, we know we do not remove our own independent ideas and cultures. We don't get swallowed up. We assimilate, we engage in the jobs and economic structures in our host societies, meaning we become, like we did in the 19th century, Germans first and Jews second, but we are always keep that aspect of Judaism, okay? Despite every Pew study telling you that we're disappearing and have been disappearing, this is exactly what we've been doing for 5,000 years. Bye, buddy. Okay, is that no matter how much assimilation we endure, whether by our own choice or others, Judaism still survives and it still maintains its own independent culture. Okay, that is not to say that Judaism has not been taking in a little bit of its host cultures. A great deal of what we do is cultural rather than theological. A lot of the things that we do and how we do them has to do with the environment in which we live. But that being said, we do not simply, if we are conquered, when we were, for instance, in Muslim Spain, we maintained our Judaism. We didn't convert to Islam. When it was conquered by the Christians, we didn't convert to Christianity. We maintained wherever we were as Jews, okay? That is a unique aspect about the Jews and the Israelites. There were many, many others in antiquity who simply converted or died out or whatever it is. We have survived, okay?
Do you know, Michael, when I'm teaching Australian students, that's the question, because we go back with anti-Semitism and this and that and the other, and that's the question that I can't answer when they ask, why does everyone else, when they're taken as slaves and they're taken to Babylon and they all integrate, and this group doesn't? This
Right.
group has maintained it. And I go, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm going to give you an answer. How about that? As we
That'd be
move forward,
lovely.
I'm going to
So
give you this
I get
answer,
asked that
okay?
all the time, and
Good.
I don't know, because it is unique, I think.
It
I
is
don't think
unique. It is
there's any
unique.
other,
And as much as
civilization.
I enjoy my Christian friends when they say to me, well, you're the chosen people, that's not really a good answer. The people have tried to kill you for 5,000 years. Well, that's not really exactly how it happened. What can account for this feat? Okay, that is the question that they ask you, Patricia. Okay, the Jews developed a cultural system to sustain ourselves without these aspects of antiquity. We did not need a land. That's huge, okay? We do not need a land to define us. We do not have a king. We've never really had a king, except in the book of Kings, right? Except when we had a kingdom, right? We had a bunch of kings, but we didn't need them, okay? There were plenty of times when we did not need one, okay? Certainly did not have one in the time of Genesis, okay? Genesis through Deuteronomy, there is no king, okay? Or fixed cultic sites, meaning one place that we worship. Okay.
What about Israel?
Aha. See, we're going to get to that, right?
What did you say?
What about Israel?
Yeah, the
Right?
Torah and all that.
Now, these are societal rubrics where everybody else had to do, right?
This was pre-1948.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, about 4,000 years before pre-1948. But the idea is, to answer back to you, is that not every Jew lives in Israel. Not every Jew has to worship in Israel to be a Jew, right? Jews do, but
Yes,
Jews live and worship anywhere in any land. But if we go back to antiquity, right, it was typically not our choice as to where we lived, right? If we think about from Genesis to Deuteronomy, we're going to get to this, right? It is a wandering book of everywhere. Our Jewish identity is not fixed upon one place. Yes.
But isn't, I guess, isn't the perception or the perspective of is flip-flopping between Jews as an ethnic group and then, let's say, Jewish people as the religion? Because let's say take Babylonian or Egyptian, okay. At that, let's say the Jews in Egypt, okay. From our history, or maybe from how they recorded history, we would be considered like what held us together as a people would be the religion, or well, no, ethnic. But I guess I guess what I'm trying to say is that what's shifting, okay, you said, well, the Jewish people just kind of grew or the population expanded. Isn't the perspective on how they're being seen, though, of, let's say, what holds them together or who's writing that history? Is it as a religious group at one time, or is it religion, or is it that same ethnic group that follows that religion?
All of it. We didn't start as a religion. We were a people. We were a tribe,
Okay.
right? That grew into a kingdom. You were part of the kingdom, and that grew into, when the kingdom was destroyed, it grew into some sort of peoplehood that incorporated some genetic ideas and some religious ideas. Okay, but we cannot put Judaism as just a religion because there are secular Jews, right? And we cannot put Judaism just as people who are born from there's Egyptian Jews and Russian Jews and American Jews, right? There's black and white Jews and Asian Jews. I mean, there's no way to pigeonhole it into that way. It is whatever it is, a nation that has moved and has different cultural aspects, Ashkenazic, Sephardic, right? Different cultural aspects that interpret it, but the ideas of Judaism remain the same in some form or another, okay? But when we did not have land or fixed cultural sites, cultic sites, or a king, what did we have which made Judaism unique? And that was literature, okay? We are a people born of literature, meaning the Torah, okay? Meaning at a certain point, our literature, and then later when the rabbis came in, the method of disseminating its contents, meaning this is our text and we know how to interpret it, became the transportive aspect of who we are, okay? Whatever you are as a Jew, you read the Torah, okay? You understand the Jewish ideals that are supposed to come from the Torah, okay? The cluster of words, meaning our Torah, this group of words, was offered as a solution, okay, to those traumas of history, meaning being conquered, being forcibly converted, all those sort of things. Literature kept people together, kept the Jewish people together, okay? That was extremely rare and certainly, I believe, frankly, unique of the Jewish people and the Israelite people. I do not believe in antiquity there was any source document that made a people survive. Okay, while the other neighboring nations destroyed or been conquering, those following this piece of literature maintained themselves. Okay, and we know that they did because we're still here. Okay, so it worked. Okay, the idea of survival then, right, becomes our focal point of our class today. Okay, that when we think about the Genesis writers, okay, and it's very hard to date the Genesis writers, so please don't ask, but they did not occur during the time of the things that were supposed to happen in Genesis. Okay, we're talking about a little bit later. Scholars vary on their interpretation as to when books like Genesis and certainly the other books of the Torah were written. Some of them, however, there's strong indication and strong scholarship to understand that some of the parts of the Torah were even written after the first exile, meaning after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. Okay, not all of it, certainly not all of it, but there are parts of it that were. Okay, but it is certainly understandable that within 1000 BCE, 1500 BCE, that these were written. Okay, the idea then is to put ourselves in the views of the authors looking at where they are in their particular aspect, trying to write their own history of survivability, saying this is how we survived, meaning we can do it here. Okay, we're going to get into that a little bit more. Okay, there was a collective connection, a connective self that the Torah created that no other religion or no other people had. Okay, is that if you were a Jew in Canaan or a Jew in Babylonia or a Jew in Germania, if you had the Torah or read the Torah, you were a Jew. There was this connection that was unbreakable, okay, in that way. All right, where this is long before secular Judaism arrived, okay? That's a relatively recent phenomena, okay? We're talking about the ancient and medieval understandings of Judaism, okay? When we think about the Torah itself, okay, and we remember that the Torah, within a scholarly literary view, is a collection of Near Eastern stories with the ideological overlay that sews them all together, and that the architects of the Torah, meaning the multiple authors that put together the 5 books of Moses, but also the editors and redactors that help put it together, we come to 3 literary themes that we see from Genesis to Deuteronomy, okay? We see the story of the ancestors. We talked about this a little bit last time, right? The Genesis really is a story of tribal growth. All of those names, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are big names to call you back to the ancestors, saying, this is where you come from. This is our origin story, okay? That's what Genesis is. There is another theme of the story of an exilic sojourn and redemption, meaning just like all these other ancient civilizations, we were in somewhere, we traveled to another place, okay, and we were redeemed. The story of the prophet then, through whom God speaks, is the idea of Deuteronomy, okay? If you're wondering where Leviticus and Numbers are, they are within that wilderness sojourn. The wilderness sojourn of 40 years became a repository for other stories and other laws that fit within these themes. But these are the main big themes, okay? Is that the story of your ancestors, the exile, and then redemption, and then you've got a prophet who your God is telling you, speaking to you through, to tell you this is how we live our lives, okay? Really important to mention is that each of these big stories, all of them occur in exile, okay? They all occur outside of the land of Israel, okay? In fact, all of the major events that occur in the Torah occur outside the land of Israel, and we will discuss in a moment as to why we think that is, okay? But remember that when we are reading about the circumstances within the Genesis story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you need to, from a literary point of view, stop viewing the circumstances from the Abrahamic point of view, but from the author in their own timeline trying to get something across to you by writing this down, okay? Very, very different writings of history, okay? According to literary critics and scholarships, Abraham is not a real figure, okay? We are not talking about the theological views. We're talking about from a literary point of view. Abraham, just like Moses, was a creation, a literary creation, okay? To whom the authors are choosing as a character to convey their voice, as to say, these are the things I want you to take from our generation by looking back at this fictional ancestor, okay? The question that they ask themselves is, how do we create a sense of solidarity when everything we took to define ourselves is in a state of crisis? In other words, the authors of the Torah are trying to say, how do we save Judaism? What pulls us together if we don't have a land, we don't have a king, and we don't have any big cultic sites? We're all over the world and we're all wandering around and we're in exile. What can we do to create that? One of the things that they create is a backstory, a common narrative of a story of origin to which all of them can then ascribe to. Okay, you may be a little bit lost today, but we all come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, that creates solidarity. Okay, creates tribal solidarity. okay? The stories we have in Genesis, we know from looking at other things archaeologically, were part of a narrative that included many more Near Eastern legends, many, many, many more. We see lots of incidents in Genesis, as well as some of the other aspects of the Torah, to say nothing of the Tanakh, where we can see stories that have been cut off, stories that have been changed, stories that have been ripped out, stories that certainly we've seen elsewhere that would go very well. Okay, looking at those things, not just the apocryphal literature of the 1st and 2nd century and much before that, but we can see all kinds of archaeological evidence to see there was beautiful, beautiful, beautiful poetry and stories that just did not make it into the canon. Okay, to create continuity, the redactors, the editors, had to look at the stories that they were going to keep or change the stories that were in there and create bridges from one to another. Okay, in other words, imagine that you have proto-Genesis, not everything, but you got stuff, okay, and it ends with Jacob, great, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then you have another person who's giving you a big bunch of literature about a story about how we're in Egypt, okay? It is your job as the author to bridge those two narratives. The Joseph story is that bridge. The question was asked, we're in this land, how do we get into Egypt? We have to get into Egypt because that's where the story goes, okay? That second half of our sequel story begins with us in Egypt, which means we got to go back and fix the first story to make sure that we get there. That's the Joseph story. And they had to do this many, many times, okay, in order to bridge everything together, okay?
You have a question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Why doesn't, I mean, I don't know if you can answer this, but why doesn't Genesis just start with Abraham? Why include all this other stuff? Because if it's the story of a people, right? That's when the story of a specific people begins. And before that, it's just like weird stuff.
Yeah. There's some that ask, why doesn't it start with the giving of the Torah? Right? That's the moment, right? And then, right? But the answer is a tough one, okay? What scholars will believe is, and I agree with their findings and their views here, is that scholars understand that this redaction and canonization of the Torah was multi-generational and had multiple schools of thought, meaning that at a certain point, the proto-Torah was handed to another generation who said, wait a minute, we need something else. And we want to put something else in, where the other generation said, no, we were fine. And that kept going, right? If we look at Genesis 1, right? Genesis 1, we believe, is relatively late, okay, the creation story. That we believe that it echoes very much the idea simply about, to teach about Shabbat more than anything else, right? Because Genesis 2 really is our origin story of humanity, right? So why did we need that one? The agendas of it are, obviously, it's all conjecture, right? But the ideas of why the Noah story is in there, well, everyone has a flood story. My guess is they wanted a flood story, right? The story of the Tower of Babel, how that got in there, remember right? Like, why is that in there? The story about how giant, gods mated with with humans and created giant. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that we can only speculate as to why things were kept in and why things were kept out, right? We have no idea. But you're right. People ask, well, why don't we just start with the first Jew, right? Abraham. Well, maybe it did at a certain point, right? But at this point, it's been through so many hands that it has, Yeah.
Genesis reference a lot in the Exodus story, like when God comes in, doesn't he say, I'm the God?
No, but those moments, those are what we call the ideological overlay. And we're going to look at a few of them, right? And the fact that if you have, right, actually, that's a great example. If you look at when God approaches Moses, God introduces God's self like 4 times differently, because 4 different authors had to say, wait a minute, we got to trace this back to whatever it is. So when God says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that is distinct, and that is an agenda move to say, remember you? No, this goes back to Genesis, all right? You're not just Joe Schmo. I'm the God of those people too, meaning I read the first book, right? You got to go back and read the first book, okay? Otherwise, this book doesn't stand alone. It's connected, okay? You got to go read the prequel, okay? Those sort of moments happen all the time, all right? So there are what we call ideological strands, which are basically the overlay, these strands that follow ourselves through Genesis. The Noah story, meaning genealogical continuity, and then Genesis 12 to 15. This is Abraham, the idea of covenant between God and Abram's descendants, okay? One thing that I think is troublesome to a lot of Jews when they read the Torah is there's all these laws and understanding and things that happen with Noah. And then all of a sudden we start again with a new covenant. There was an old covenant with Noah, then there's another covenant with Abraham, and there's all these and they don't sort of go together. And that is by design. These were pushing things, narratives together that they then had to try to marry and put together a little bit, okay? So for instance, if we read Genesis 15, okay, it says, sometime later, the word of Adonai came to Abram in a vision. He said, fear not, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward will be great. Look toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to count them. And he added, so shall your offspring be. And because he put his trust in Adonai, he reckoned it to his merit. That's a very specific covenantal promise, okay? That is, look at the stars, that's going to be you, okay? That's a literary thing to say. If you look backwards, right, you can say, why are the Jews the way they're Jews? Well, God said to this guy, that's going to be us one day, okay? Abram will have a future of prosperity. He'll be rich, progeny, okay, and land ownership, okay? The three components for the covenant of the Genesis author, okay? Meaning the Genesis author believes these things are necessary, okay? Other authors, as we see in Deuteronomy, envision these things differently, okay? Deuteronomy talks all about the Holy Land and all about Israel's rights to its ancestral lands, laws, and social customs. Abram and Abraham have no understanding of the Torah and laws and any of that. He exists without those aspects of its future. The Deuteronomist, on the other hand, you cannot possibly do without these laws. These laws are what make you you, okay? We see the difference. The author involved in Deuteronomy, commandments, okay? There is nothing in Genesis to say that you need to follow any commandments to be Jewish, okay? These are two different authors with two different views, okay? The idea of a covenant with the deity happens all the time in the Near East, okay? That is not unique to us. The idea that this is, and your people, that's very, very big, okay? Every culture in Near Eastern had their own God and their own relationship with that God and covenant with those specific people, okay?
Question here.
Yeah.
In the Ten Commandments, it says, you shall have no other God before me.
Yeah.
Does that mean the other gods don't count, or I'm the only God?
Arguable. Most likely monolatry, meaning I'm your God and don't have any of the other guys. The other guys aren't good. I'm your God. Others
So
will
is that
argue.
acknowledging that there were other gods?
Yes, it is.
Isn't that?
It is. Yes. People will argue that it is not, that is purely monotheistic. We do not believe that to be the case.
Well, that's right. The English, the grammar in it does indicate that they're saying there are others.
Correct.
And I'm the best one.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what monolatry was, and very, very common among this idea that every people had their God and they were chosen by that God. Ours was Adonai or Yahweh or whatever it is. So I'm your God. You won't have any of the other guys. I'm that guy. I'm the best one. That's the idea. Others will argue when they say any other gods before me is that they don't exist. But to me, that's a stretch. Okay. All ancient civilizations, however, believe themselves to be divinely chosen. If we think about the pharaohs, each one is chosen by God. They are the gods, the Alpha and the Omega and all that sort of stuff. The king would be that way as well. But the Israelites' covenant is not with God and a king. Okay. The covenant is with Joshua Abram. Okay. Or Abraham. Okay. Abraham's not a king or a ruler. He's just a Jew. okay? The people directly, meaning there is, through the intermediary, the prophet, okay? That's talking about when Abraham is chosen, he spreads the word, right? Isaac, Jacob, Moses, the ultimate prophet king, not a king, but kind of a king, but mostly a prophet, the intermediary between God and a people. Remember that one thing that really distinguishes modern Judaism and even ancient Judaism from all the other religions is that the revelation occurred to everyone at Sinai. 650,000 people witnessed that revelation instead of Jesus says so or Muhammad says so or whatever it is. Everyone was there. That was a really radical departure from the ancient paradigms. Yes?
How come only the descendants of Jacob end up being the Israelites, though, instead of like Esau, all those other people?
So those are genealogical. So great question. If we look back and think about it looking in reverse, right? Your job is to create a genealogy to you. Now you're living in a world where you've got other people around you, right? Your job then is to create a story where the big brother or the little brother, right, comes to you. The big brother or the little brother who's stupid or not good or whatever it is, those are your neighbors, right? Right. If you're going to make a origin story for the world, right, which is from your perspective, you would say, okay, we're descendants of Jacob. Jacob was awesome. Esau was an idiot. Esau's got to be those guys over there, not us, right? You need to acknowledge that they exist, right? But the ideas of the blessings, and that's why if you look at who blesses who and all that sort of stuff in terms of the brothers, it's always the Jewish line through Jacob, through the tribes, right? The other ones don't get the blessing, or they split off and do this other stuff because you can't just erase them from existence, right? The idea, the narrative is we're all connected, but we're the best. Like we're the best of that line of humanity, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So they still have a kind of a right to the land. They're just not as important. Is that kind of?
No. So, well, when we say that, we get into political battles. But when we're talking about the ancient understanding of the right of the land of Canaan, we're talking about that this particular line, meaning the Abrahamic to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph line. You follow that genealogical line. It splits off every other places, right? Those are not the lines that follow the Jewish people, though they become other lines, other peoples, right? We remember our story last time about the Moabites, right? We wrote the origin of the Moabites as this horrible incestual thing with Lot and his daughters, right? Basically insulting our buddies, the Moabites, right? That is probably not the Moabite origin story. It's the one we came up with to say, this is why you don't get into the land of Israel. You know, that kind of idea.
So everybody, all the Israelites by Exodus are the descendants of Joseph.
Yes, that's the idea, right? That's the idea, is that, and the brothers, right? And brothers. So when the Jacob's family moves to Egypt at the end of Genesis, that is the family or families that begin and eventually over 430 years make hundreds of thousands of Jews. Okay. So one thing I wanted to mention in terms of the covenant that we saw in Genesis 15, meaning fear not, Abraham, I'm a shield to you, your reward will be great, look towards heaven, all that sort of stuff. And then the covenant we see in Deuteronomy 30, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life if you and your offspring would live by loving Adonai your God, heeding God's commandments and holding fast to God. By thereby you shall have life and shall endure upon the soil of God swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them. Okay. This new covenant language, okay, the idea of the promise of land, progeny, and wealth, okay, none of that's realized in Abraham's time. Okay, Abraham never gets to the land or anywhere close, really, to settling in the land of Canaan, or any of that sort of life and death and curse and blessing. None of that has anything to do with the conversation between God and this person. Okay, the covenant is on completely different terms, completely different places. Okay, but The transition from Egypt to Canaan can't be conceptualized as a restoration, for the land of Canaan had never been Israel at the previous point in history. Okay? Thus, all the Deuteronomist, meaning the author, the school of thought, could do was just mention the patriarchs without giving too much detail as the contents of the oath. In other words, imagine that you are writing Deuteronomy, okay, and you are trying to complete this book and this covenant, okay? You can't call it Israel because it wasn't Israel at this point. We can't say that you're getting Israel back because you never had it. All you can do is basically say, I swore back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's my connection to that. And we see that parts of ideological overlay a lot. When Jacob rises from his dream of the ladder to heaven or whatever it is, there was going to be a beautiful story about something, very Magic Beanstalk sort of thing, about going up and down the ladder up to heaven and all these gods are walking, right? But instead, Jacob wakes up and all of a sudden God says to him, I'm the God of Abraham. And I mean, it's ridiculous if you look at it from that point of view of like, it is so obvious of a departure to say, no, not that story. Our story. This is about our story. Jacob, you're attached to these guys. Now keep going, right? That's the idea, okay? Our unsuspecting Torah reader, which many of us are, okay? We're unsuspecting Torah readers, will do all of the harmonization required, perhaps never noticing how much dissonance is injected by the forced fusion of the covenant based on commandments and by a patriarchal covenant that had no such contingencies. In other words, it's both, okay? Who cares about your ancestors if all you have to do is follow these laws? Well, they had to, right? But there's an incredible distance there. It can't be both. To say either you're a part of this covenant because of genealogy, or you're a part of this covenant because you choose to be. Here, they are trying to do both and failing at it, frankly. Okay? They're saying, choose life. And by the way, I'm the God of your ancestors. You can't do that. Okay? I mean, you can, it won, but you can't do that. All right? It is basically, and the reader will just say, well, whatever. Sounds good, right? But if you look at it from that point of view of the different sort of covenants, there's this huge distance as to which one is it? Which is it the fact that we were there at Sinai and we chose to follow your commandments? We didn't have to be. Or is it that we're all related and that we go back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? You can't say that both of them are part of the covenant, but they do. Okay? Again, we shouldn't think that this was literary dissonance. This was historical, meaning the authors were trying to harmonize and put things together because of what they wanted to do in their own time. This does not have anything to do with the real time of Deuteronomy. This has to do with long after Deuteronomy, okay? The original book of Genesis, we don't know, we can speculate, but most likely ended with the fulfillment of the covenant in the Abraham narrative, okay? The 12 tribes living happily ever after in Canaan, okay? But at a certain point in our literary history, we had the book of Exodus, or at least parts of the book of Exodus. We couldn't get rid of it, and we needed to get ourselves into slavery and then out of it again, okay? It's like looking at a sequel to a book and having to write the first one and saying, this is not how I would have ended this book. Like, why are we in Egypt? We don't need to be in Egypt, but they didn't have that choice. It was already so well versed. All these other people already knew the Egypt story that you can't just get rid of it. At least that's the theory, right? Is we ask ourselves, why did they just throw it out? The best answer that we can give is that it was too much part of the culture already, right? We can't just do away with it. We needed to connect the stories, okay? Pretty cool. So as I said, one of the Torah redactors saw Genesis as the ancestral history that led up to the Egyptian sojourn story. In other words, these were two different stories, but one said, well, we can connect them. We need the bridge, right? They were two stories written by two authors for two hugely different purposes. Okay? These were not buddies who got together and said, I'm writing an Egypt story and I'm writing this story. They had to fuse these things together. Okay? By doing so, the dynamics of our meta-narrative, what we call the meta-narrative, were permanently transformed. Okay? By fusing two stories together, we change everything. You have to and you have to go back and change and look at things and the contingencies of it. Okay, there's this what's the part Jacob's bones, right? There's when they put Jacob's bones in one part of Genesis, they have to mention it again that they're taking Joseph's bones or Jacob's bones with them, right? And they need to go back and do all these sort of self-corrections to fulfill that. Okay, and they didn't do everything, but they did pretty well, I have to say. So when people say, oh, there's all these inconsistencies in the Torah. Yeah, there are. Because of this reason. Because you're taking two books written by two different authors and trying to fuse them together. It's almost an impossible task, but they did it. Okay. Yeah, so when you relate the stories of Genesis and Exodus separately, which I think we should do, just like you would read a book as far as like Jonah or anything else in Genesis, you never say they're connected, right? You wouldn't think of them as inconsistent, okay? If you read them separately and imagine that they're two different books, fine, no big deal, okay? There's no inconsistencies when you read them alone. When you read them together, one after another, you get those inconsistencies, okay? And they're basically just two ideas as to how to approach the same problem. How can we transcend the chaos of dispersion? Okay. In Genesis, it was creating an origin story, talking about a promise and a covenant. In Exodus, it was a prophet who leads you out of slavery and redeems you into and puts you at the base of your God's mountain. And I mean, these are their ideas on how to do this, okay, to provide hope, okay? Again, I said this in all caps, okay? All the formative episodes in the Torah take place outside the land of Israel. That is something that we cannot overstate more. It does not happen in the land of Israel, okay? Where do we see God for the first time? Not in Israel. Where do we get the Torah? Not in Israel, okay? We get the Torah and the revelation literally in the middle of nowhere, in exile, okay?
Why is that so, why did you put that all in caps? Why is that so important?
Well, that's so important because if we think about Judaism's pull towards Israel, the biblical promise and the land and all that sort of stuff, it is frighteningly strange that none of the huge events in the most important parts of our book of the Torah taken from Sinai occur in that land, okay? Secondly, that's the first one. The second thing is, if we look at this from a literary point of view, and we look at this from multiple authorships, which occurred outside the land of Israel, right? If parts of Exodus are written after the exile in 587, if parts of it are written before we have been into Canaan or whatever it is, the idea that the authors are trying to get across to you is we don't need the land of Israel to be Jewish. Okay? There is a strong argument that I taught last year called a silence too loud, meaning that basically no one talks about Sinai in the rest of the Bible. It happens like 3 or 4 times that they mention it, something like that. It's extremely small. That is because most of the prophetic episodes happened, at least later, the prophets happened before Sinai was written about, okay, meaning before the exile. So the idea of Sinai, at least certain scholarships, other scholars fiercely deny it, but certain scholars, and I agree with this particular scholarship, is that the idea of Sinai was born out of the fact that the house of God was destroyed when the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem. Remember that it wasn't a symbolic home. Literally, they believed God lived in that home. Okay, and so imagine that is destroyed, right? Your homeland is destroyed, your kingdom is destroyed, your God is destroyed. So your writing then has to be, we are exiled, right? So how do we survive? Well, the writing then has to be that we got the revelation in the middle of nowhere. We can sustain ourselves in exile. Okay, huge turnaround in terms of that idea. Okay, that lesson, which I love to teach, talks about how the name Zion occurs never in the Torah. Okay, never ever. All right, the Zion in Jerusalem never occurs in the Torah. That's crazy. Okay, with all these promises and with all this, right? Never, right? And that the prophets later talk about how Zion is the center of our world. Okay, because at that point they were living in Zion, they were living in Jerusalem. There's the incredibly problematic phrase that we chant every Torah service: Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. From Zion comes Torah. No, it doesn't. Torah did not come from Zion. It did according to those prophets. It was later rewritten to say that it couldn't come from Zion, it came from Sinai. Okay? Whole nother awesome lesson. Okay? I gave you a nice example here at the bottom. We're going to have to wrap up soon, but at the bottom here is taking a look at one particular editing technique that is done. Okay? In Genesis 12 to 15, the editor added verses to the storyline to anticipate the integration of Genesis and Exodus narratives. Okay? And this literary trope, this literary strategy, we can look at and trace and see how they were doing it. Okay, is an excuse is inserted for why the land could not be secured according to the surface meaning of God's promise during the era of the patriarchs. In other words, if you read Genesis and you read, as the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell upon Abram and a great dark dread descended upon him. And he said to Abram, know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve, and in the end they shall go free with great wealth. Well, yeah, I've read Exodus. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, you shall be buried at a ripe old age. And they shall return here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites not just complete. When the sun set, and it was very dark, there appeared the smoking oven. Okay, so what the author is doing here is most likely the original text said the sun was about to set and it was very dark. There appeared a smoking oven, a flaming torch that passed between those pieces. Okay? What the author did was he inserted the dream sequence here to Abram to talk about, to bridge this idea of Exodus. Okay? There is a resumptive clause, meaning the editor resumes the narrative. Okay, that is a huge literary trope when a narrative is broken. Okay, the sun sets, or sun's about to set, the stuff happens, the sun sets. Okay, that is a purposeful resumption and insertion. Okay, sometimes we see this with poetry, we see this with inset poetry, that the narrative ends at a certain point and then begins again. If you pull that poetry out, it works just fine. Okay, and we've studied that last year as well. In this case, this author needed for you to hear, 1, you'll be strangers. 2, you're going to be oppressed for 400 years. If you think about it in the most obvious way, right? It's like someone read Exodus and was like, wait, we got to tell them. We got to tell you. This is going to happen. Okay? It doesn't make direct mention to Egypt, per se. And they were wrong about 400 years. It was 430. Okay? But they were trying to get that across. Okay? That they were trying to be vague. They're trying to say, this is coming. Okay? That figure was adjusted later in Exodus. Okay? It's basically to prepare you as a reader for the history. If that makes your head spin, I don't know what doesn't, right? To prepare you for history. okay? Meaning you have to read and understand the history that they are building for you to go forward, okay? Shifting one's expectations in regard to the book's ending. Can you imagine if you've never read Exodus before and you're reading Genesis and everything's going great for Abram and it says this, spoiler alert, okay? 400 years in where, when, right? What are you talking about? That's how the book ends, right? It is a travesty from a literary point of view, okay? There's another example here that goes into some detail. If you turn to the last page, though, I'll end on this sort of very cool little aspect. One of these sort of inconsistencies, right? If you look at Genesis 11:31, the narrative says Terah, meaning Abram's father, Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, to the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram. They set out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to the land of Canaan, but when they had come as far as Haran, they settled there. Okay, meaning whose idea was it to go? Terah. Terah said, let's go. We're going to this place, the land of Canaan, but we got as far as Haran, we stopped. Okay, simple, easy. 12:1 says, Adonai said to Abram, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Except they're not at their father's house anymore, in their father's land, in their land anymore. They're already halfway there. They're in Haran, okay? It was Terah's idea who left Ur to go to the distant land. So then why is Abram now being told, go forth from your native land? They're not in their native land anymore. It's not your idea. It's not God's idea, okay? By the time we get to Genesis 15, okay, we see God said to him, I am Adonai who brought you out of the land of Ur of Chaldea. No, he's not.
No, Dad did.
His dad did. He's taken all the credit, okay, to assign this land to you as a, no, he is not. If we did know that, he would say, I'm Adonai who brought you halfway from Ur at Haran. I stopped you and said you should go this way. But that's not what he says, okay? I'm Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt in the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me is in Exodus 22, and you can see the parallels, okay? I am the God who brought you out from blank, okay? That is on purpose, okay? Which one was written first, I cannot tell you, okay? But obviously, there is this same story about the same thing. At a certain point in history, the idea emerged that a movement from a state of displacement to a place of rightful sojourn could only occur by divine intervention. Meaning, it is not, we are not going to Canaan because our father had the idea. We are going because God told us. We are not leaving Egypt because we're sick of slavery. It is because God took us. When you get that idea, you have to go back and change it. Okay? The redactors depicted this journey as a kind of redemption. Abram traveled from Ur, right? And Moses journeyed from Egypt, right? This idea of displacement and journey, the Jew of the diasporas. This is our last point today, friends. This is where we are as a people now. Okay? We do not feel displaced. We do not feel exiled. Yes?
I'm confused about the word redemption. Is it from the word redeem?
Yes.
And this redeem is when you pay off when you're kidnapped.
No, it is redeemed as in a divine redemption, saved, rescued, fulfilled. I mean, it is like you're divine redemption. Okay, like when we are moved from slavery to freedom, we are redeemed. We're not just paid off. Okay, but the idea that I want to end with is the Torah was written for people who were in the diaspora, who were in exile. Okay, for those who could then understand, if you read from Genesis to Deuteronomy, that it's okay that you're living in the diaspora because all these important things happen in the diaspora. Okay, we feel the same way as American Jews. We're in the diaspora. We feel we'll give money to Israel and we'll go and visit, but we don't feel a divine pull that we must live there. Okay, we have made peace with the fact that we are Jews without that land, that we live where we live. The Torah writers were writing to the same kind of audience, okay, that there were people who are displaced. We don't want them to feel displaced. We want them to feel this is fine. We got the Torah in the middle of nowhere. You can live wherever you want. That sort of thing, okay? That's why there's very little connection in the Torah to Zion itself, okay? There's promises and all this sort of stuff, but remember that the Torah ends with us looking out onto the land of Israel, where Moses looks out across the river, okay? So much parallel there to how the Jews of the diaspora must have looked by the rivers of Babylon back onto Israel and say, yeah, we want to get there eventually. We'll get there eventually. But we're okay right here. We have everything we need. Okay? Last questions? Okay, friends. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Cool stuff, right?
Right, wait.
This stuff is way cool.